What if the story you were told was carefully edited, and the uncut version was never meant to leave a private phone? Let that sink in for a second. Because tonight, we're not starting with a palace, a prince, or a crown. We're starting with a friendship, a marriage, and a moment that, according to explosive allegations, was captured when it never should have been. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud for years. What if the rise didn't begin after the divorce, but during it? From the outside, everything once looked clean. A struggling actress grinding her way through Hollywood. A husband behind the scenes. A tight inner circle that protected her image. That's the version that made it into magazines. That's the version people repeated. But insiders have always whispered that the timeline never quite made sense. And now, suddenly, those whispers are being dragged into the open. According to claims circulating behind closed doors, a private video, never intended for public eyes, exists. Not staged, not promotional, just a raw moment. A conversation. A context that raises one devastating question. Was Meghan Markle allegedly involved with a co-star while she was still legally married to Trevor? Before you jump to conclusions, pause. This isn't about salacious details. It's about timing, loyalty, and silence. Because if this were just gossip, it would have died years ago. Instead, it's resurfacing now, and that alone should make you uneasy. Ask yourself this. Why would something so damaging wait this long to appear? The answer may lie with someone who once stood closest. Someone who defended, protected, fixed. Someone who knew exactly what to say to the press, and what never to say at all. Jessica Mulroney wasn't just a friend. She was an insider. A gatekeeper. The kind of person who hears things before the world does. And if allegations are true, she may have heard something that couldn't be unheard. Hollywood marriages don't usually explode. They fade. Quietly. Carefully. With stories prepared in advance. But sometimes, something interrupts the script. Sometimes, a single recording changes the power dynamic completely. And that's why this matters now. Not because of romance. Not because of scandal. But because narratives are currency. And when someone decides to stop protecting yours, the cost can be enormous. Think about it. If a marriage was already unraveling, if careers were pulling in opposite directions, if temptation was present and boundaries blurred, where does responsibility begin? And who gets to rewrite the ending? Tonight, we're peeling back the layers slowly. No rush. No conclusions yet. Just facts, contradictions, and the questions people were told not to ask. Because once we understand how deep that friendship ran, we can finally understand why the silence broke. And when it did, everything changed. The most dangerous secrets are never held by enemies. They're held by friends. Think about that. Because if these allegations are even partially true, then the story doesn't begin with a leak. It begins with loyalty. The kind of loyalty that's quiet, protective, and incredibly useful when reputations are still being built. Jessica Mulroney wasn't just around during Meghan's early climb. She was embedded. Phone calls, private conversations, late-night venting sessions that never make it into interviews. This wasn't a casual friendship built on brunch and photo ops. This was a relationship forged in ambition, trust, and shared understanding of how Hollywood really works. And that's important, because Hollywood friendships aren't innocent. They're strategic. They're survival-based. You don't just share lipstick shades and red carpet tips. You share fears, weaknesses, mistakes, the kind of moments you assume will never be repeated outside the room. Ask yourself this. Who do you confide in when everything feels uncertain? When your career is accelerating, but your personal life is quietly collapsing? That's where Jessica allegedly came in. Insiders have long claimed she knew things long before the public ever suspected anything was wrong. She saw the stress, the distance, the cracks in a marriage that still looked intact on paper. And according to whispers, she also saw something else, an emotional closeness that raised eyebrows long before anyone dared question it. At first, protection was automatic. That's what friends do. You deflect. You spin. You redirect attention. You help keep timelines clean and stories simple. Because in Hollywood, perception isn't just reality. It's leverage. But here's where the tone shifts. Friendships like this don't break overnight. They fracture slowly. A misunderstanding here. A loyalty test there. And eventually, silence replaces closeness. Calls stop getting returned. Messages go unanswered. And suddenly, the same person who once protected your image becomes someone who remembers every detail you hoped was forgotten. So what changed? Some say it was ego. Others say it was fear. And some suggest it was survival. Because when public opinion turns, even the strongest alliances start to feel expensive. Now imagine being the person who knows where the bodies are buried, metaphorically, and realizing that staying silent might cost you everything. Your credibility, your reputation, your future. Would you still protect the story? Or would you let it speak for itself? This is where the alleged recording enters the conversation. Not as a weapon at first, not as a threat, but as proof. As something that existed quietly, waiting, while circumstances shifted. And that's what makes this chapter so unsettling. Because if Jessica truly heard what's being claimed, then the silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional, strategic, maintained until the balance of power shifted just enough. So the real question isn't why this story surfaced. It's why it stayed buried for so long. And once we understand what was allegedly being protected back then, we're forced to look at the marriage timeline very differently. Because the dates don't just matter. They expose everything. Here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because timelines don't lie. People do. On paper, the marriage looked simple. 2 people, a wedding, a few years together, then a clean break. That's the version most people accepted without question. But when you slow it down and actually look at the dates, the locations, and the sudden shifts in momentum, something starts to feel off. Ask yourself this. How does a marriage survive when one person's world is shrinking and the other's is exploding? At the time, Trevor Engelson was working behind the scenes, producing, pitching, grinding in an industry that rewards patience but rarely celebrates it. Meanwhile, Meghan's career was accelerating fast. New visibility, new routines, new environments, and most importantly, new proximity to people she suddenly spent more time with than her husband. Distance matters. Not just physical distance, but emotional distance too. There were long stretches where they weren't in the same city. Filming schedules that didn't align. Public appearances that stopped happening together. And yet, the marriage technically remained intact. No announcements. No explanations. Just quiet separation disguised as normalcy. Here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing. If everything was already over emotionally, why maintain the appearance at all? Hollywood insiders often say this is where things get messy. Marriages don't end cleanly when careers are at stake. They linger. They exist in limbo. And during that limbo, boundaries can blur faster than people want to admit. Now layer in a high-pressure set environment. Long hours. Emotional scenes. On-screen chemistry that bleeds into real life. This isn't scandalous by default. It's common. But it becomes controversial when vows are still legally binding. And this is where whispers begin. Not confirmations. Not proof. Just a growing sense among those nearby that something didn't align. That the emotional center of gravity had shifted elsewhere before the paperwork caught up. Think about it. If you're still married on paper, but living separate lives, where does accountability land? Does intention matter more than legality? Or does legality define the line no matter what? That question sits at the heart of this entire controversy. Because those who defend the timeline argue the marriage was already over in every way that mattered. But critics counter with a sharper point. If that were true, why keep it quiet? Why not end it cleanly before stepping into something new? And then there's the detail that refuses to go away. The alleged overlap. A period where emotional closeness with someone else may have existed while the marriage still technically did. No photos. No public proof. Just patterns that, once noticed, are impossible to ignore. This is where narratives start to crack. Because once you accept that the timeline wasn't as straightforward as presented, you're forced to ask an even more uncomfortable question. Who else noticed at the time? And more importantly, who chose not to say anything? Because if someone did notice, and if they later referenced it in a private recording, then the next chapter isn't about marriage anymore. It's about the person at the center of that overlap. And once that name enters the conversation, the story shifts dramatically. Here's the line that makes rooms go quiet. Hollywood sets are intimate places, and everyone knows it. But when intimacy crosses from performance into personal territory, that's when stories stop being harmless. So let's ask the question people allegedly whispered but never confronted directly. What happens when chemistry doesn't turn off after the cameras stop rolling? Long days, long nights, scenes that require emotional closeness, rehearsals that blur into real conversations. That environment doesn't automatically create betrayal, but it does create opportunity. And according to insiders, that opportunity existed at exactly the wrong time. Notice what's missing from this story. No paparazzi photos. No public scandal. No dramatic confrontation. Just a growing awareness among those nearby that something felt different. A tone shift. Familiarity that seemed too comfortable. A closeness that didn't match the official narrative of a marriage still technically intact. Here's the contradiction that keeps surfacing. If nothing inappropriate was happening, why did so many people later describe the same unease? It's not about proving anything outright. It's about patterns. And patterns are hard to unsee once you recognize them. According to allegations tied to that private recording, a name was mentioned casually. Not dramatically, not as a confession, but as if the context didn't need explanation. That's what unsettled people the most. Familiarity suggests history, and history suggests overlap. Ask yourself this. If you were speaking privately with someone you trusted completely, would you be careful with your words? Or would you speak freely, assuming nothing would ever leave the room? That's what gives this alleged recording its weight. Not what was said, but how it was said. Calm, unguarded, almost dismissive, as if the speaker never imagined the words would be scrutinized years later. And this is where the story tightens. Because once the possibility of a co-star overlap enters the conversation, every prior decision looks different. The delayed divorce, the quiet separation, the carefully managed public image. Suddenly, those aren't coincidences. They're damage control. Defenders argue this is all circumstantial. That Hollywood is built on false assumptions and exaggerated narratives. And they're not wrong, sometimes. But critics point out something harder to dismiss. If there was truly nothing to hide, why did the story remain so aggressively controlled for so long? Why did so many people who allegedly noticed things at the time stay silent? And why did the truth only start to surface after friendships fractured and loyalties shifted? This is the moment where the story stops being about romance and starts being about power. About who gets protected. About whose version becomes official history. Because once a secret survives long enough, it stops feeling like a secret. It becomes a liability. And the moment someone decides they're done carrying it, everything changes. Especially when that person knows exactly how the story began. And next, we have to confront the one question no one could avoid anymore. What finally made the silence break? Silence is powerful, until it isn't. And this is where everything circles back to the very first question we asked tonight. Not who did what, not who was right or wrong, but why the truth, or at least this version of it, waited so long to surface. Because secrets don't usually explode. They leak. Slowly. Strategically. When the conditions are finally right. Think about the path this story took. A marriage that quietly unraveled. A career that accelerated at the exact same time. A friendship that once functioned as a shield. And a private moment that allegedly existed, untouched, while years passed and narratives hardened into public truth. That's not chaos. That's control. For a long time, silence worked for everyone involved. It protected reputations. It kept doors open. It allowed reinvention without interruption. And as long as loyalty remained intact, the past stayed exactly where it was supposed to be. But loyalty has limits. And when relationships fracture, the rules change. Ask yourself this. How many stories do you believe simply because they were told confidently, repeatedly, and without visible contradiction? How many timelines feel clean only because no one dared challenge them at the time? This isn't about proving allegations beyond doubt. It's about understanding how power shapes memory, how image can outlive reality, and how the people closest to the truth are often the last ones to speak, not because they don't know, but because knowing too much is dangerous. What makes this story linger isn't the alleged recording itself. It's the implication that the official narrative was always just one version. A curated one. A version that depended on silence to survive. And once that silence cracks, even slightly, everything feels different in retrospect. Suddenly, old interviews hit differently. Old photos feel staged. Old explanations sound rehearsed. Not because they were lies, but because they were incomplete. That's the unsettling part. Because if this much could stay hidden for this long, what else have we accepted without questioning? This is where the audience comes in. Do you believe timing is coincidence? Or do you believe timing is strategy? Do you think emotional distance excuses overlap? Or does legality still draw the line, no matter how distant a marriage becomes? And most importantly, do you think the truth always comes out, or only when it's no longer useful to keep it buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Not slogans, not insults, real opinions. Because conversations like this don't move forward unless people are willing to sit with discomfort. If you want the next chapter of this story, the one that shifts from Hollywood into a much larger stage, make sure you're subscribed. Because what followed these early years didn't erase the past. It amplified it. And the moment the past collides with power on a global scale, the consequences are far bigger than anyone expected. Because this story didn't end with a divorce. It was only getting started.